In this video I would like to talk you through a section of Auguste Comte's text Plan of the Scientific Work Necessary for the Reorganization of Society that was published in 1824. I will only look at a particular section of the text, which is actually quite long. The text as a whole is 80 or so pages. I'm only looking at the second half of the introduction, which contains some of his principal ideas of what his overall project is, the project of sociology, and in particular the project of what he refers to as positivism. So this text, the plan, is in a sense the closest thing probably we have to a sort of foundational manifesto of the discipline that Comte later refers to as sociology. And at the same time it is also, of course, a foundational text for positivism in the sense that Comte understands this concept. That's why it is worthwhile to look at this text somewhat more closely. What I'm doing here in this video is pretty similar to what I'm doing in the first chapter of my book, Beginning Classical Social Theory. So if you wanted to have a more detailed and more complete introduction into that text, then apart from obviously reading the text itself, which is the real task, you could also, of course, use the chapter on Comte in my textbook. But this following will give you sort of the gist of the whole thing. So Comte begins here by distinguishing two principal tasks that are necessary to formulate the big plan, the plan for the reorganization of society. Of course, reorganization in the context of the situation after the French Revolution. So as you know, Comte's situation overall was to accept and to be committed to maintaining and consolidating the results of the French Revolution, but at the same time trying to contribute to the reorganization of society in such a way that no further revolutions will be necessary. Indeed, that further revolutions are preferably excluded and prevented from happening. That was Comte's outlook, like that of many of his contemporaries who were thoroughly fed up with revolutionary upheavals, but did not at the same time want to go back to the old regime, obviously. That is the general context in which this text was written. And Comte conceives of sociology as a discipline that would play a key part in bringing about this form of consolidation and stabilization of the modern post-revolutionary kind of society. Now he says here, the formation of any sort of plan of social organization is necessarily composed of two series of operations. So two kind of things need to be done, completely different. One, theoretical or spiritual. When he uses the word spirit, he basically means something like what we would probably call cultural in a broad sense. This series of works, so the one strand of what needs to be done, the theoretical or spiritual strand, has as its goal the development of the seminal idea of the plan, so the big idea that underlies the plan, the new principle according to which social relations must be coordinated, and the formation of the system of general ideas intended to serve as a guide for society. That's the big idea. Basically, he's proposing we need a theory. The other strand of things that need to be developed is practical or temporal in the sense of mundane. It determines the mode of distribution of power and the system of administrative institutions. So we need to do two things, Comte suggests, to reform society. We need a big idea, the plan, the theory, and then we need a practical plan that is about power, distribution of power, and about building institutions. These are the two things, and that is basically what positivism or Comtean sociology is all about, these two things in their combination. Now in this first section of the text, it is his principal concern is to establish basically the order of sort of, how do you say, the order of urgency for these two parts of the plan that is that needs to be carried out. And Comte's emphasis here is, and you will perhaps find that surprising, because that is quite different from what we usually associate with the word positivism, which we usually nowadays take to mean simply to mean a total focus on empirical research, which is part of the concept, but it's not the entire the entirety of how Comte uses it. He emphasizes very much that the theory has to come first. So first you need to have a solid theory, and then you go about the reform of society. And so here in the first page, he's basically saying that up to now, so up to this point at which he formulates this intervention, his contemporaries have neglected to make this distinction between theory and practice, basically. So he argues here very strongly, and this is a characteristic of positivism, to separate theory and practice, which he says not to make the distinction is against the natural law of the human mind, and so on. And he says all the failure since the revolution to reform society and bring it into a new stable form has to do with this failure not first to develop a proper idea of what the progress should be. Here in the next paragraph he says, any system of society, whether made for a handful of men or for several millions, has as its final object to direct all individual powers towards a general goal of activity. For society only exists where a general and combined action is exerted. This is one of his principal propositions for the theory of society, that society as a whole has one goal. So there is a unity and a sort of single-mindedness to society as a whole. There's an interesting footnote here from the editor of this translation. He quotes John Stuart Mill, who's commenting, who's very critical of Comte's perception, although in the beginning they were friends in some periods, for some period of time. But Mill, who is obviously one of the most prominent representatives of liberalism, which is overlaps but is quite different from positivism as an intellectual tradition in this period. He particularly objects to this idea that there is a one central unitary goal to the whole of society. So he rejects this. This is what you find here in this footnote, which is quite funny. So for Comte, we have here this statement, this is what distinguishes, so to have one common goal within society, this is what distinguishes human society from that of other gregarious animals, which is kind of a very strange statement, because I suppose we, who probably have much more sort of liberally trained sort of mindset, we would probably say exactly the opposite, no? That certain animals, when we see animals moving in concert, that strikes us as particular animal-like, and we probably would like to think of our individualism as what makes human society particularly human. So for Comte it is basically the opposite. So to have a common goal for combined action, that is the most defining characteristic of human society. Now he makes a distinction here between what kind of goals societies can have, and this is of course the point that his theory that he is proposing to develop will have to establish what is the goal or the unitary purpose of the new type of society that is emerging after the French Revolution of 1789. He says here that there are only two possible goals of activity for a society, whatever context that may be. Universally, there are only two types of society, basically. And these two types are related either to the societal goal of conquest, so basically a kind of a military type society, or a society is geared towards production. And this is the society geared towards production that is characteristic of the modern, newly emerging type of society. And that is, of course, the society that we are living in. That is our society that Comte is talking about here at its infancy. So Comte, like others you study in the context of classical social theory, but to a certain extent is actually predictive. So these people are extremely perceptive of the changes that are taking place in the 19th century that really come into their own only in the 20th century, or indeed in the present now. So we live now in a society that is totally committed to the idea of production. So this is the central value that dominates society. So Comte is in a situation where this type of society, or if you like, the hegemony of that kind of society, needs to be established in the first place. So he says the military goal, so to organize society along military values and ideas, that was the old system. The industrial goal, industrial here in the sense of industriousness, productivity, is that of the new type of society. That's what all this is basically about. So, and here in the last paragraph here he states again that in the recent past people mistook simple modifications of the structure of society for a total change of the old system. So he's basically saying we've just been tampering with the structures of the old regime, but we need to have a really fundamental change of the overall character of the system. That's the goal, and that's what the plan is all about. So we occupied ourselves in dividing up the old powers and in setting up their different branches against each other. That refers to the idea that legislative and executive need to be separated, basically as in liberal theory. So this is a critique of liberalism, if you like. And he says these are just basically cosmetic changes that do not change the overall character of the culture, or if you like, the overall spirit of the type of society. That is not affected by these constitutional and basically legal reforms that have taken place in the context of modern society. The direction of society, this purpose, the goal, the overall dynamics of society, the nature of the powers were conceived as the same as ever. So basically people haven't been radical enough by far. That's Comte's starting point. So in the next section he brings in a part of his what I think is central to his intervention here. That is the idea that there is a division between spiritual and temporal power. He finds that very important, and he refers repeatedly to the Middle Ages as a period in which European society has established and has basically, as he thinks, was thriving on the basis of that division between spiritual and temporal power. So that is basically cultural, religious and political power, if you like, the power of the state being the temporal power. So this monstrosity of a constitution without spiritual power he sees as a regression towards barbarism. That is what is happening in the recent past in European countries. Basically he's saying people are trying to make changes in society in the area, in the sphere of the legal text of constitutions and legal codes without actually reforming the spirit of society. And that's you will find the text is quite repetitive. Comte is not a great writer by any means. There is quite a lot of repetition, but on the other hand, repetition is usually our friend, because the more the same points are repeated, the better our chance to actually understand what the point is. So in that sense, we shouldn't complain about repetition, but there's a lot of it here. So he hammers home the idea that the reform has to be at the level of the spirit of society, not just the letter of the law and the constitution and so on. That is only kind of basically the small print, the details. So he again talks about this fundamental error of not making these reforms at the level of the general dynamic, the idea of society. So it is thus that the peoples, he always talks about peoples in the plural, that is, because he's actually referring to Europe as a whole. So when he says peoples, he means the different nations of Europe. So Comte's perspective, and that is quite interesting because that has to do with his relatively friendly view of the European Middle Ages, where the entirety of European civilization, if you like, wasn't so strictly divided up into nations, certainly not nation states that didn't exist. As opposed to the modern period, where this is, of course, a characteristic. So Comte thinks at the level of Europe as a society. That's why he talks about peoples. And he seems to suggest here and elsewhere that in all European countries, people basically are in the process of doing the same things, just at different speed and in slightly different matters, in slightly different manners. Obviously the situation in France is very different from any other European country, but for him that is only a matter of degree. So he thinks of Europe really as one society, of which the different national societies are just relatively minor subdivisions. That is not terribly important. Or actually, the national divisions are a hindrance in the process of reforming society. So that is one very interesting point that becomes clear a bit later in the text, how European Comte's perspective is. So what has been happening in the recent past is not that a truly new social system was being developed or advocated, but it is simply the old system has been stripped by the critical doctrine. By critical doctrine he means the Enlightenment. He means Enlightenment philosophy, the critique that is formulated by Enlightenment philosophers. They have stripped the old system of everything that gave it vigor. So the old system, the old regime, basically the leftovers of the feudal order and absolutism, the absolutist state and the idea of divinely protected monarchy and so on, all this has been stripped of its vigor. So the Enlightenment did a very good demolition job on these ideas, but it has failed to put anything in the place of these ideas. And therefore what the Enlightenment has produced, according to Comte, is a fleshless skeleton. So basically the old system has not actually been overcome, it has just been stripped down to its bones. And it is weak and just barely existing. But the new thing, the new type of society has not really come about yet. And that's where the true reorganization comes in, and this is obviously what the big plan that Comte is planning to or intending to formulate comes in. That is the big reform that is needed. Not just some modifications of the old system, and certainly not more of that critical doctrine. So he had enough of the Enlightenment, none of that anymore, because that's just negative. The Enlightenment is just a negative critical doctrine. It's a critical theory, if you like. None of that anymore. That's over. The job is done. The demolition job is done. Now philosophy and societal practice have to become positive, so they have to build the new system, the new society. That is the thrust of Comte's perspective here in this text. So more and more of the old feudal and theological system has been destroyed. Total anarchy is the current situation, and so on and so forth. That is the situation in which Comte makes this intervention. So then here in the next page he basically makes his argument for the primacy of theory. So he says here that in any sort of manufacture it is obvious that first you have to make a plan and then you set about how to do stuff. So we have these two sorts of consideration, theoretical and then practical. And everywhere in all areas of society, it is acknowledged that first comes the theory, then the practice. And he says it should be exactly the same in the theory of society. So first you need a theory of society, and then from that theory, if you have the theory sorted out, then you deduce from that theory the practical steps that are to be taken. And without that, there will never be any successful reform of society. So he says here, this is a nice passage to quote, the man who, and it is always man, so women don't actually occur in this text at all as far as I remember. The man who, whatever the subject may be, claims not to allow his mind to be directed by theories, restricts himself to refusing to allow the theoretical progress made by his contemporaries and to sticking with superannuated, basically outdated theories long after they have been replaced. And he gives the example here of medicine. So people who reject modern cutting-edge medicine basically are very likely simply to stick to some crude charlatanism, so the kind of thing we would probably refer to as traditional medicine or traditional healing or so on. So Comte wouldn't be having any of that, that's quite clear. So the refusal of theory simply means that you're sticking to bad old theory rather than keeping up with the development of theoretical discussions. In the next paragraph, what I find interesting is his use of the formulation of the collective and individual intelligence of the human race. And he says that this develops, so humanity as a whole, he conceives of as a collective. That's very interesting, I think. This division becomes more and more pronounced, that is the division between theory and practice, and becomes more and more generalized. So he thinks that the division between theory and practice is a general characteristic of modern society and is one of the reasons for progress in modern society. At the same time, however, it is important that there is harmony between theory and practice. So they are not simply they're not separate and unconnected. They are separate but in harmony. That's the important thing here. And obviously the harmony comes about because the theory, the plan, the big idea has total dominance over practice and power, organization and institution building and so on. And then here comes the passage where he says surprisingly friendly things about the Middle Ages. So he's saying that this distinction between theory and practice was actually established by Christianity, which makes a distinction between the realm of the spirit, where you follow, of course, divine law, and the temporal realm, where you follow the law of the land or the law of the kings and princes and so on. This is indeed a characteristic of medieval civilization. And Comte is quite in favor of that. So he thinks that distinction or that sort of arrangement where you have a distinction between spiritual and temporal power, whereby the spiritual sort of rules over the temporal power, as he thinks was the case in the Middle Ages. That's the way it should be. Now we got rid of the feudal and theological systems. There's no papacy anymore. Well, actually it is still there, but it's nowhere near as powerful as it used to be. So we have to replace that spiritual power by a new modern spiritual power, and this is where sociology comes in, or rather positivism as an overall philosophical perspective. So the next section continues with this theme that we can learn something from the Middle Ages, which is quite a surprising sort of thing. So not many people in his context would have insisted on that. Certainly his liberal contemporaries would not have would not have been saying anything similar to that, because for them the Middle Ages, we are really glad to be rid of that stuff. It's quite interesting and strange that Comte suggests that we could learn something from the Middle Ages, and the way especially the division between spiritual and temporal power was organized. So this is basically repetition, so there's a lot we can kind of jump over here. Again, a comment on contemporary society. It's disorganized both from a spiritual point of view and from a temporal point of view. So in its total anarchy on both levels, spiritual and political, if you like. That's the situation in the present period. And he describes his plan here explicitly as an effort to close the revolutionary era. So the revolution, and that is the era to which the Enlightenment belongs. So Comte sees the Enlightenment in philosophy and the French Revolution in practice as two sides of the same coin. Again, it is the spiritual and the practical, political, that are separate things, but they're interconnected here. And that is, and the period of the Revolution is the period of the Enlightenment, and that's over, or that should be over, that should be closed. And the force to achieve that is positivism, in particular positivist sociology. So, we must obviously deduce the absolute necessity of separating the theoretical works of social reorganization from the practical works. So, we just in case you haven't got that yet, so he repeats that here again. The system of social relations and the administrative forms, that is what the practical works are about. So the priority of the spirit over practice is basically the priority of substance over the form that substance should be taking. That's basically just restating the same thing in slightly different words. Society must be reorganized in a manner commensurate with the present state of knowledge. Again, knowledge is basically just another word for spirit. So when he says spirit, he actually means the overall, the totality of knowledge and culture in society. So the next section, sorry, where are we? Yes. So the peoples, the European peoples in the immediate post-revolutionary period or in the post-Enlightenment period have misunderstood the nature of the task, etc., etc. And as an effect of this misunderstanding of the task, which again is what they misunderstood is that there are these two aspects to it, theory and practice. The misunderstanding had the effect that they were basically commissioning the wrong kind of people, and he refers to them as the class of legists. So legists is basically lawyers, so people who are dealing with the law, people who are trained in the law, so people who write constitutions and legal texts and so on. And Comte thinks that in the following of the Enlightenment, and that is a characteristic of the revolutionary period, it was mostly lawyers who were entrusted with the reform of society, and he's not happy with that. So that will not lead anywhere if you leave it all to the lawyers. And there's a second group which he calls the Metaphysicians, which for us basically means philosophers, in particular rationalist philosophers of the Enlightenment period, the 18th century philosophers. That's what he refers to as metaphysics. They were the one who gave these lawyers their principal ideas. These principal ideas, the metaphysical ideas, are such things as freedom, emancipation, self-determination, these kind of things, which are non-tangible things, so they're abstract concepts, which ultimately derive from theology in Comte's perspective, but obviously in the 18th century take the form of philosophy as metaphysical concepts. And he doesn't like that very much either, because these metaphysical concepts, they were good in the context of demolishing feudalism, so to overcome the old system, the old regime. But now that this task has been completed, we should abandon these metaphysical concepts and just focus on positive science. And the lawyers are useless anyway, because they are only really good for eloquence. They're good at persuading people, but they're not actually really coming up with ideas. So lawyers and that type of people you can make use of to a limited extent if you need to persuade other people, but not when the task is actually to come up with a plan, to have to formulate a goal for society. So what we need is reasoning, analysis, coordination, etc., etc., and we need something better than just a huge army of lawyers. And what we need is the scientists. That's Comte's thing. So he's the whole text is basically a kind of a celebration of scientists. That's what we need, and in particular social scientists, namely sociologists. So that's basically the cream of the crop. That's what we need to have. That's the people who can bring about the reform of society. And he says here, these works being theoretical, so what needs to be done now to develop the theoretical concept of society, it is clear that men who make a living out of methodically forming logical theoretical combinations, that is, the scientists engaged in the study of the sciences of observation, are the only ones whose type of ability and intellectual culture satisfies the necessary conditions. So they are the people we need to have now for the reform and reorganization of society. Now he gives a whole series of reasons why the scientists are the most able and most important people in this context, because they have a method that is universally recognized as the best, because all the world believes in science. That's what Comte thinks, and therefore these people have the moral authority, so people will believe scientists rather than lawyers, philosophers and politicians. So the education, which means the system of intellectual habits, which results from the study of the sciences of observation, is the only one capable of properly developing their natural theoretical capacity. So sciences of observation is Comte's phrase here that means basically empirical sciences. Observation refers to the empiricism of modern science. There's a footnote here that I find quite funny, but I would like to draw your attention to, where he basically sort of relativizes what he's saying here. And the footnote is this one. We include here among the scientists men who, without devoting their lives to the special cultivation of any science of observation, possess an aptitude for science, and have made a sufficiently close study of the general shape of positive knowledge to be penetrated by its spirit, and to have become familiar with the principal laws of natural phenomena. This is very funny because he's basically talking about himself here. So Comte himself is obviously not actually a scientist. So he's somebody who writes about science. So he's basically a philosopher who writes a text, which is the text we're reading here, that explains why scientists are the greatest people. But he isn't actually a scientist. So he's basically, what he's describing here in this footnote is, I think this is very funny, somebody who is sufficiently close, who has sufficiently closely studied the general shape of science. So he has studied what scientists do, and thereby he has become penetrated by the spirit of science. He says then, here in the middle of this of the footnote, the other scientists, meaning the actual scientists, are too absorbed by their particular occupations. So he admits basically that actual scientists are quite specialized, and they might perhaps not really be the people who come up with a great sociological general idea. So he brings in this footnote the need, well, actually you need people to sort of second order scientists, and obviously he means himself by that, who study what the scientists do, and they come up with the actual big plan. So that is his little kind of a footnote in which he basically contradicts what he's saying in the body of the text, which is kind of cute almost. I find that I like this footnote. It's very funny. So this is funny because he basically undermines his own argument, argues basically in the footnote the opposite of what he's actually saying in the body of the text. So he's kind of, if you like, deconstructing his own argument and basically a bit like in a Freudian slip. In the footnote he's admitting what he really actually is about. Namely, he tries to establish the dominant position of somebody like himself, who is basically a theoretician of sort. So somebody who reflects on science. He's not actually a scientist. Anyway, here we are back in the main text now, end of the footnote. In the system to be constituted, spiritual power will be in the hands of the scientists, and temporal power, now that's interesting, will belong to the heads of industrial works. So we have this division between spiritual and temporal power. Spiritual power, that's for the scientists, and temporal power to organize power and institutions and so on, that will be done basically by industrialists, by the heads of production. So that's the two groups who will govern the society of the future that Comte aims to establish. So the industrialist will organize the administrative system. So we have here sort of a utopia of a society that has scientists as spiritual guidance and has basically what we probably would call capitalists organizing the state. That's Comte's vision. That's the idea of positivism as expressed here in its foundational text, which is quite interesting because it is so incredibly true. It is so incredibly perceptive, because this is basically very close to what we actually have, give and take, more or less. Now, the next section here is also worth reading out in full, this passage here. It has been observed in the previous chapter that the critical doctrine, so the Enlightenment, has produced in the majority of minds, and tends more and more to strengthen, the habit of setting oneself up as supreme judge of general political ideas. This anarchic state of the intellect, erected as a fundamental principle, is an obvious obstacle to the reorganization of society. So this is a very clear statement against individualism. So against the idea that every individual in society should make their own judgments of everything. A clear statement against democracy. So is a statement of the authoritarianism of Comte's conception of positivism. That's very interesting to keep in mind. And he puts this kind of science-based, so the authority of a science-based executive and a science-based leadership of the state and society, that he opposes to what he calls the politics of whim, where basically just come up with stuff, make it up as they go along, which obviously doesn't lead to anything. So the rule of the scientists and the industrialists, of course the industrialists, the heads of industrial works, as he calls it, they are also scientifically trained, because the industry is based on science. So industry and science, in Comte's mind, are very closely interconnected spheres of society. So it makes sort of sense from his perspective that these two groups should be leading in society, and they will not perpetrate any politics of whim. They will do solid, science-based, planful, well-planned politics. And that will have an enormous uncontested authority. So you can see he uses the word authority in a perfectly positive sense. But you could also say this is actually quite authoritarian, because he does not consider, which probably most people would connect with the idea of science, certainly in the contemporary, in the present period, that science is actually about everybody being allowed and encouraged to question everything. That certainly would be the democratic definition of what science actually means. So this is not Comte's understanding. So for Comte, it is actually up to the best trained specialists, the elite of the science, to determine what is true and what is not. So this phrase, this passage here, this is the habit which society has gradually acquired since the foundation of the positive sciences, of submitting itself to the decisions of scientists for all particular theoretical ideas, a habit which the scientists will easily extend to general theoretical ideas, at the general leadership of society, when they are entrusted with their coordination. So in the same way that we trust scientists to know that, well, things that we can't actually test empirically ourselves, let's say such things as, I don't know, that the Earth is spherical rather than flat. I mean, nobody has actually seen it, but we trust science as an institution as a whole to have established to sufficient to our satisfaction that this is the case. And he thinks that exactly the same will be true for politics if politics is handed over to the scientists. And now he moves on to something that I find particularly fascinating. So he's writing the following. The present crisis is evidently common to all the peoples of Western Europe, though they do not all participate in it to the same degree. Obviously, the French, with their constant revolutions, are slightly ahead of the game here, but he thinks that basically what happens in France is just slightly in advance of what will happen everywhere else. Nevertheless, it is treated by each of them as if it were simply national. But it is obvious that a European crisis needs European treatment. That is an extremely interesting statement. So Comte, and I think this has to do with his soft spot for the Middle Ages, where you had basically a united Europe that was united in the papacy, basically spiritually united. So he hankers after that and says basically that modern scientific, technical, and what we would call capitalist civilization, that is what unites all these different countries, to the extent that the distinctions between these countries are ultimately irrelevant. That is Comte's perspective. So in that sense, it is an entirely globalist position that Comte is taking here, which is quite fascinating to read in a text from 1824, maybe not what you expected. He says, this isolation of the peoples, so that everybody just thinks that stuff that happens in their country has somehow to do with their country. Not so. The isolation of the peoples is a necessary consequence of the fall of the theological and feudal system of the Middle Ages, the church basically, the unity of Christianity, a process which dissolved the spiritual bonds which that system had established among the peoples of Europe. Christianity, basically. And which there were vain attempts to replace with a state of reciprocal hostility, which is called the European balance of power. So that is sort of the early modern arrangement between the emerging modern states in the European state system. So we said, yeah, that was a sort of transitional sort of solution. The critical doctrine, the Enlightenment, is incapable of re-establishing the harmony which it destroyed. So that's one of his principal propositions in all his writings. And also the Enlightenment, the critique, the negative power of critique has created this isolation. So every country thinks they are basically in this game on their own and for themselves, when actually in reality these societal processes are what we would say global. So for him, global obviously means Europe. So that is the world that the world that Comte is thinking about. It's not the actual total world, but Europe is that world. So in that sense, his thinking is globalist. The true organic doctrine, that is the doctrine of positivist sociology, can alone produce this union, so imperiously demanded by the state of European civilization. So the state of our historical situation is crying for spiritual unity, and positivist sociology will deliver this unity based on the authority of science. That's the idea here. This union will be more perfect than that produced by the old system. So this will be better than Christianity. For their union existed only in the spiritual domain, whereas today it must equally come about in the temporal domain. So that these peoples are called upon to form a true general society, complete and permanent. Basically, if you like so, a hypercharged version of the European Union. That's what Comte is talking about here. So there will be the spiritual union of the spirit of modernity, and that will also produce, more or less automatically, a unified political administrative structure. So these two spheres that he thinks have to be distinct, nevertheless move together. They move in concert, the spiritual and the temporal, the cultural and the political, if you like. A true general society, complete and permanent. That is Comte's vision, based on cooperation between all these different countries under the leadership of the scientists. Now, the new organic doctrine, that is the force destined, the force that is destined to form the new organic doctrine must be a European force. So that cannot be a national group. That is extremely interesting. So Comte is totally not nationalist, which especially for a French philosopher is extremely rare. So he's completely thinking at this level of Europe as a spiritual unit. And obviously, you probably guessed it, it is the scientists who are this who are this European force, because science is in reality not organized at the national level, which is true. In the 18th century and in the 19th century, certainly scientists were forming an international sort of community. And also in the present period that is the case. Science is basically not national. So science, the processes and the discussions and discourses of science are organized at a much higher level than that of the nation state. And that's what Comte emphasizes here. And that is the force for good in his perspective. It is noticeable that scientists alone form a true coalition, compact and active, all of whose members understand each other and correspond easily and continuously from one end of Europe to the other. That stems from the fact that they alone today have ideas in common, a uniform language, a general and permanent goal for their activity. So in that sense, the scientists are today what the Church used to be in the Middle Ages. That is an extremely extravagant and sort of fascinating idea, I think. And this is the central idea of positivism, which is probably quite different from what you thought positivism was, because nowadays when we talk positivism, and usually it is for people to accuse each other of being positivists, because it is probably, certainly in our discipline, mostly a sort of an insult. What we mean really is to be a sort of crude empiricist. But you can see, although Comte is obviously very much an advocate of empiricism, it is quite different from sort of number crunching, because there is a very much an overriding philosophical and political and societal perspective attached to that commitment to empirical research. And that is Comtean positivism. So both these aspects are very important to emphasize. So scientists are this international force that have a language and ideas and so on. And then he says, even the industrialists, so preeminently directed towards union by the nature of their work and by their habits, still allow themselves to be too dominated by the hostile moods of a savage patriotism for it to be possible at this time to establish a truly European combination among them. That can only be produced by the action of scientists. And that's why the scientists should have the upper hand. So as you remember, the scientists are in charge of the spiritual, and the industrialists are in charge of the mundane, the temporal, the political and administrative. But the leadership should be with the scientists, because they are truly global, or international if you like, whereas the industrialists, they are sort of leaning towards combination and union and so on, but they're still somewhat too there are two sort of receptive to patriotism. So there's too much nationalism in industry. So science is a safer bet to be having the leadership here in what is needed to reform European society. Then he makes an interesting observation, which is that the kings of all these European countries, and we are basically looking at here, this is the 1820s, that is basically the period of restoration after the French Revolution. So Comte is writing against the overall trend in that period of reaction to reassert itself. So the aristocracy in all over Europe is reasserting its power, and against that Comte is writing, of course. And he observes here that the kings and the aristocracies of Europe are actually internationally organized. So they are all interrelated, they're all intermarried, they're basically a large family of monarchies and aristocracies. So they are actually organized internationally. And the weakness of the peoples, by which he means the populations, the third estate of all the European countries, they are weakened by being so much confined to the boundaries of their nation states, of the dynastic states as they exist at the time. So the peoples think too much in national terms, whereas their enemies, the reactionary kings and aristocrats, they are organized internationally anyway. So the thing to do for the peoples is, in order to win this battle, is to reorganize internationally under the leadership of science. That's another interesting aspect here of Comte's conception. And then he, in the next paragraph here, is another polemic against Enlightenment Metaphysics. So he's basically rejecting the tendency at the time that the leaders of opinion, by which he means liberals basically, critique the fact that different states intervene in each other's social reforms, but by that he means basically that the reactionary regimes of Europe intervene in France and so on, and the other way around, so that more reactionary states intervene in the more progressive affairs of some other countries and so on. And he says this criticism is feeble because it is only the application of the critical doctrine, by which he means the Enlightenment, to foreign relations, because it is based on the idea of non-intervention, the idea of national sovereignty. And he rejects these kind of concepts, which are 18th century concepts, as being metaphysical, irrelevant. Forget all that. Do not even bother making these kind of criticisms. So what matters is to create the reality of an internationalism based on science and business, basically. That is his perspective of what true reform and thorough reform needs to be based on. So it is clear that the peoples of Western Europe, having a common and interconnected civilization in this context basically means the state of development of culture and economy. Whether it is considered in its development over time or in its present state, form a great nation. Right? Again, here, all of Western Europe, at least, that's his horizon, form one great nation, whose members have reciprocal rights, which, though doubtless less extensive, are of the same kind as those of the different sections of a single state. So again, this is sort of anticipates the idea of a European overall kind of state that supersedes the national states of which Europe is composed. So again, more polemic against the Enlightenment. So this critical idea business prevents the peoples from uniting, etc., etc. Only the force of science can really Europeanize the whole development. That's the next argument here. Again, the spiritual coalition has to be superior to the temporal coalition, etc., etc. Only the scientists are competent, only the scientists are organized enough, they have the authority, and they are European enough, so they are kind of internationalist enough to bring this about. So next page, the combined force of European scientists, again the same thing, a positive theory needs to be established, and then here in italics, the scientists must today raise politics to the rank of the sciences of observation. So he demands that there is a science of politics, and politics is here basically identical to what we would call sociology, because in this period there isn't really a theoretical distinction between society and the state, so it's more or less the same thing. So he demands that there should be an empirical science of politics, and that is of course what sociology is. That is that's the thrust of the text. And then he brings in this idea that you are probably familiar with from other contexts, the famous 3 states of knowledge. So Comte argues that every science goes through 3 states of 3 different theoretical states. The theological or fictional state, the metaphysical or abstract state, and then the scientific or positive state. So you are, I'm sure you're familiar with these concepts. And what is interesting is that he's actually saying here, and again that is quite remarkable in this paragraph here in the middle, that even the theological first stage, so the kind of primitive stage of human knowledge, is still already in its time, in its context, long ago, at the beginning of human civilization, already a form of science. Because theology is basically the science that was valid in that period. That's quite interesting. So that is an example of Comte's, if you like, relativism. So Comte has a strangely or surprisingly relativist conception of knowledge and of social forms in general. So forms of knowledge, such as theology, might have been valid in a different historical context. Only now they are not valid because we're in a different historical context. So he says here theology and fetishism, all this kind of primitive religion sort of forms of knowledge, they had their place in that early stages of human civilization, but now obviously they're irrelevant. And the same is true of the second state, if you like, that of the Enlightenment, that of metaphysical thinking, that is based on metaphysical concepts, ideas which are no longer wholly supernatural, so they're not actually theological concepts, but they are sort of personified abstractions, which is such things as justice, freedom, emancipation, self-determination, and so on. They had their day, they were valid in the 18th century in order to destroy the old regime, but that's done now, and now they're irrelevant, and so now we are in the third state, which is that of positivism, obviously. I guess you probably got the point, because he repeated this already 15 times on these pages. Now the third state is the definitive mode of any science, and in this stage facts are connected according to ideas or general laws of a wholly positive kind. That means that the general ideas or the theories are suggested or confirmed by the facts themselves. And that is, of course, this particular aspect of Comte's positivism. That is what nowadays people usually refer to when they talk about positivism. The idea that theory is basically derived from and confirmed by data, by observable facts. Obviously, as you can see in Comte's actual conception, this is just one small aspect of the whole overall conception. And then he goes through his theory of the development of knowledge. He says that the major sciences, astronomy, physics, chemistry, and physiology, they all went through these three stages, so they're now all positive. The last one was physiology, because it's the most complicated. It is the most complicated because it presupposes the others. So physiology presupposes chemistry, because our body is full of chemical processes. The chemical processes presuppose physics, because they are basically molecular physics, if you like. I think that's the idea. And that presupposes astronomy, because everything that happens on our planet obviously presupposes the existence of planets as such, and the entire planetary system, and so on. And he says astronomy was the first science that became positive because it's the easiest, actually. It's the least complex. It's in a sense it is the crudest of the sciences, whereas physiology is the most complicated because it has so many interactions and so many levels of analysis. And even more complicated is sociology. So sociology, or politics as a science, that is by far the most complicated of all. That's the most complex science, and therefore it took so long to reach a positive or positivist state. But we are there now, and Comte is the man to bring it all about. So again, polemics against the Enlightenment on this page here. Metaphysical ideas. The social contract is a metaphysical idea, of course, because it is if you read Rousseau or any other similar text, it is clear that the social contract is an idea. It's not an empirical fact. It never happened. It is something that is good to think with, and as such, it is a metaphysical concept. It's a philosophical abstraction. The idea of rights, same thing. Rights are not empirical facts. The idea of right is an idea that is good to think with. And we might think of rights as being somehow natural, which is actually a theological idea. Comte quite rightly points that out. So it has theoretical roots that go back a very long time. But they are not empirical facts. So within positivist sociology, social contract has no place, rights has no place, justice has no place, freedom has no place. All this stuff we have to forget about, because that is metaphysics. So we have to purify social science from all these 18th century concepts. And he mentions explicitly Rousseau as somebody whom we have to supersede, because that is 18th century and we are well beyond that. So that is old stuff. So this is the spirit of the positive doctrine. Where are we? We are nearly at the end of the introduction here. The sciences have become positive, one after the other. That's all good news. And now we can move to politics as a positive science, a system of social order. So he's basically discussing here, and that is quite interesting. He is reflecting on why is it only now that positivist social science has become possible. And that is because the reality basically asks for it. Also, that is an astonishingly modern and interesting idea. So Comte actually reflects on why his own thinking is actually possible. That is, I find that quite remarkable actually, and that's what he does here on these last pages of the introduction. So we don't need to go into too much detail about that. His plan is to elevate politics to the rank of the sciences of observation. I think you got that point now. In the hands of the combined scientists of Europe, etc., etc. The goal is to regulate and preserve society from the terrible and anarchical explosions with which it is threatened, all these revolutions constantly taking place, etc., etc. So we need an improved social system that is stable and consolidated and safe from revolutions. And then basically he that is the end of the introduction, and he says basically there are 3 series of works, and in the next 60 pages or so he describes what his plans for the future are. Basically he's describing in this short, relatively short text, just 80 pages or so, that's short for Comte's standards. He basically describes what his plans are for the next 20 years. So you can see also for himself, Comte is incredibly organized. So he makes here a plan for basically his academic work for the next 20 years. And the funny thing is he actually did it. So he actually produced all these works. These are the massive volumes of the positive philosophy, and then the second set of massive volumes of the positivist politics. And this is where he actually fleshes out the ideas that are presented in condensed form, relatively condensed form here in the great plan of scientific work necessary for the reorganization of society. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you more or less enjoyed this, and yes, thank you. Bye bye.